Welcome to our first lecture for English and Women's Studies 3073, Section 50. This lecture is entitled New England Voices Part 1, and we're going to be looking at two poets from the early years of what would eventually become the United States. Scope of this course really is to examine literature written in English in that part of North America that eventually became the United States, or that is the United States. So that's where we're going to start off with. You could study a lot of different kinds of literary works, Spanish language works, Native American language works, but we're focusing on English because that's what the course is. It's an English class as well as a women's studies class. So we're going to dive in with two of the most interesting figures, I think. Maybe these are figures you've heard of before, maybe you haven't, but I may end up having to divide this into two different videos, so stay tuned. We'll see how long this one runs. I'm going to start off with Anne Bradstreet, and of course she was a Puritan poet, and hopefully you read a couple of her selections here in your Showalter text. We'll start talking about those in just a few minutes, but let me give you a little bit of background about Anne Bradstreet and the context, the historical context. Interestingly enough, the first book published in English by what we would consider to be an American, somebody living in that part of the North America that would eventually become the United States, was written by a woman, Anne Bradstreet. And the title of it, of course, was The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America. There's a very interesting story about its publication, which I'll share with you, and it's kind of touched on in your head note. By the way, always read head notes for our selections out of the texts. Allegedly, and I say allegedly because you can, decide for yourself whether you think this was a credible story or not, her brother-in-law sort of absconded with the text, brought it back to London, and published it allegedly to her great surprise and shock. Bradstreet was a Puritan who, along with her husband and many, many thousands of people, fled England during the persecution of Puritans in the 1630s. Of course, as a woman, she was not regarded as someone who was supposed to be a great writer at all. Tried her hand at poetry, and no doubt her friends or close associates said, "These are really great, you should publish them." The story goes that she says, "Oh, no, they're not good enough." But her brother-in-law supposedly grabbed them, took them. He was on the boat. It was too late. He's brought them to London, and they get published. And of course, I don't know whether she genuinely was shocked or surprised by it, or whether she simply feigned that outrage. She says, "Oh my goodness, much against my will." It would be very convenient for her to argue that this was done against her will, or somehow a surprise to her, because how else would a woman be able to get published very easily? She was, quite honestly, a very unusual person for having done that, but one, for being a woman, second, for being a Puritan woman, was not considered to be an appropriate sort of thing for a Puritan woman to do. It was entitled The 10th Muse because, of course, in Greek mythology, there are 9 muses. These are sort of demigods that inspire the different arts, right? Calliope and all the others. And she's now the 10th muse, you see, sprung up in America. A little bit about Bradstreet's upbringing. I think it's very important for you to know. She was, of course, born in 1612. She was married at age 16 or so, we think, to Simon Bradstreet. Her father was really kind of the estate manager for the Earl of Lincoln in England. Now, when you look at that, you say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, her dad was some sort of a manager of some sort. Well, an estate the size of the Earl of Lincoln's would have been like a major, major corporation today. So he was sort of like the CEO of a major corporation. It was big. As a result of that, she lived at the Earl of Lincoln's home, his estate, and as a little girl, she had access to his library, which was very substantial. Now, think about this for a moment. Shakespeare died in 1616, so there's no way she went and saw one of his plays, that we know. However, it is instructive to say to ourselves, this woman really was a Renaissance woman. She was brought up in the home of a man who would have had many volumes of Renaissance texts from all over Europe. She learned more than one language. We know that. And she had the opportunity to read Shakespeare and Johnson and Bacon and all the great English writers, as well as Erasmus and probably a considerable amount of classical works, Ovid and a number of different classical writers. So she had quite an education without having a formal education. And even by the age of about 16, when she got married, she would have had considerable exposure to literary works. So bear that in mind, as she's a Renaissance woman and very, very literate, would have been an avid reader of poetry. We'll get to her relationship with her husband a little bit later on, but suffice it to say that he was somewhat older than she was. I believe he was in his 20s, and although that might raise some eyebrows today and maybe even have us called, the police, at the time it was not terribly, terribly unusual. And evidently they had a wonderful, beautiful relationship, and were very much in love with each other. Regardless of what you think of the story of its publication, we should probably dive in and talk a little bit about the prologue, at least, because of course a prologue is the beginning of a work. Now, how would she write the prologue if she didn't know it was going to be published? Well, the answer is this prologue is really for the second edition. So we have an opportunity for her to, when the second edition comes out, she writes a sort of cover poem, if you will, an introductory poem. And it is very much worthy of our consideration. Take a look at it here in your Showalter book on page 3. And we won't go through the whole thing, but it's a very curious poem because a prologue to a book of poetry generally is sort of an explanation, a sort of a foreword, an introduction. But look at the rhetorical strategy she employs here, because this is super important. She says, "To sing of wars and captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my mean pen are two superior things." Meaning, don't expect me to do this, right? Mean as in lowly. These are too superior. These are beyond me, right? I'm not Homer, right? Writing of great epics and things. Let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim their worth. Right? So she's already sort of diminishing your expectations. Very clever, right? Oh, don't expect much from me, right? And then if it turns out to be pretty good, you say, well, you know what, that was pretty good, this isn't bad. Stanza 3 is an interesting one. From schoolboy's tongue no rhetoric we expect, nor yet a sweet consort from broken strings, nor perfect beauty wears a main defect. My foolish, broken, blemished muse so sings, and this to mend, alas, no art is able, 'cause nature made it so irreparable, right? It's a horrible line at the end. It's almost purposefully, I think it's purposefully a bad rhyme at the end, to sort of mark it or blemish it. So what she's saying is, you don't expect great speeches or rhetoric from a schoolboy, right? He's not going to give a great speech. And you don't expect a pretty song from an instrument with broken strings, and you don't expect beauty from somebody who's got a major, ugly aspect to him, I guess. So don't expect much from me. You see how she's diminishing the expectations? Very intentional here, even with an intentional flaw in that last couplet there. So she goes on in stanza 5, having done that. Very interesting how she constructs this. Now she's going to get the question of her gender, okay? I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says that my hand a needle better fits, right? Carping people, right? And they say, oh, she should put that pen down and pick up a needle to knit with, right? Because she's a woman. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits, and by wit, by the way, wit in the Renaissance means intelligence, right? It doesn't mean being funny. It means being clever or ingenious. They cast despite on female wits. They don't think much of it. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or it was by chance, right? So in other words, I'm in a no-win position. It's a catch-22 for me. If I don't do well, they'll say, see, told you women can't write poetry. But if I do well, they'll say, she stole it, or she lucked out. Anybody can write a good poem. You write 1,000 poems, one of them's going to be good. So she says, I'm in a no-win position. And then in stanza 6, she says, but sure the antique, meaning ancient, Greeks were far more mild. Else of our sex, why feigned they those 9? And poesy made Calliope's own child. So amongst the rest they placed the arts divine. So all the muses are female. The Greeks were even more charitable than we are, right? And they're supposed to be, ancient and backward and, heathen and all that stuff. But this week not, they will full soon untie. The Greeks did not but play the fools and lie, right? So even this, they won't accept this argument that the Greeks were even more charitable and generous to women writers than we are. They were a bunch of pagans. So we won't take our cue from Greeks. Then in stanza 7, let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel, but it is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. And at the end of stanza 8, this mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine. We would say glittering gold, but they said glistering at the time. So break this down. This is the most interesting part of the poem and the most controversial part, where she basically says, oh, forget about the Greeks and whatever. Men have precedency and still excel. You're better than we are, right? You're smarter than we are. You're better writers than we are. Men can do best and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours. You're better than us at everything. Yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. In other words, you're better than we are. So if you are, why are you threatened by reading something that's written by somebody who admittedly acknowledges that men are better writers? Now, we'll put aside for a second whether she really believes that, okay? But she even says towards the end of stanza 8, this low and unrefined ore, right, rough ore, right, not gold, okay, right, as opposed to gold, which has been purified and made into like jewelry or bars or something like that. Mine is unrefined. Will make your glittering gold but more to shine, right? Ought to make you feel good to read something as bad as mine. Why are you threatened? Why are you so threatened? A lot of people have looked at this and said, how sincere is she in the belief that men are better writers and men have greater intellect? Men are better artists and so on. Some would say, no, as a Puritan woman, she would probably be someone who grew up with that belief and that she sincerely held it. Others look at the way stanzas 7 and 8 are constructed and say, this is clearly a rhetorical, argumentative, clever device. By saying, well, you guys are the best. You're just terrific. I mean, why criticize me? I mean, I've already said that you're better than I am. After all, my crummy poetry just serves to make yours look better, right? She's clearly flattering and appealing to the ego of the male reader to defuse the argument against her being a woman and a poet. Because if they criticize her, she says, well, why are you picking on me? I already told you your writing is better. Well, that makes you look pretty crummy, doesn't it? Or if you're a woman who says, put your needle down, and she says, put your pen down and pick up your needles, she says, but why can't you do both, right? I mean, I'm not claiming to be, Ben Jonson or William Shakespeare. I'm not claiming to be that. I'm just somebody who, and by the way, I didn't even mean to publish this. My brother-in-law grabbed it, kidnapped my poems, and took it over there, and I'm just horrified that he did it. You'll have to decide for yourself how sincere she is on this. And we'll look at the next poems here in the next slide. But I want to cover a couple of things about Puritanism that also play into this and some of the other poems. First, the Puritans were an offshoot, we won't go into all the history, of the Church of England. Henry VIII wanted a divorce, splits away from the Catholic Church, starts what's called the Church of England. The Puritans, in a nutshell, were people who felt that that was a good first step, but they wanted to purify that Church of England by getting all the non-believers out, by getting rid of the old vestiges of Catholic worship, holding the worship ceremonies differently, restructuring the church, all those kinds of. So that's why they were called Puritans. Okay, and the only difference between Pilgrims and Puritans was that the Pilgrims came over first on the Mayflower, and they just didn't want to stay in the Church of England. The Puritans wanted to stay part of the Church of England. They just wanted to purify it. So they were seen as really, really kind of religious zealots and radicals. But they also believe very much in two things that are very important. One is a very strong overriding idea of providence. That is, that God is involved in all of human affairs. God knows what is going on. Everything that happens to you happens for a reason. This is the notion of providence, right? Not fate. Fate's a pagan idea. Providence is the idea that, not by chance, but by God's planning, that everything that happens to you, everything that happens on earth is because of some reason, and you may not know what the reason is, but God does, and there is one. And the second thing is the idea that God knows everything, therefore he knows who is going to be saved and who is going to be damned. This is the doctrine of election. Now, the Puritan would be very careful to say God doesn't make you sin. He just knows ahead of time who's going to sin, who's going to ask for salvation, who's going to choose properly. He doesn't make you choose one way or the other. He just knows what choice you're going to make. You don't know that, but he does, because he's God, right? So if he knows what you're going to choose, he knows whether you're going to choose salvation. He knows whether you're going to choose to turn to Christ and away from sin, and he therefore knows who's going to heaven or hell. Here's the difference. You, as the believer, don't know that. All you know is that you need to be making the right choices day by day throughout your life and constantly examining yourself. And so the Puritan would look at literature. The Puritan would look at literature as a self-examination frequently. That is one of the functions of literature. It's not the only function, but frequently in Puritan literature, you're going to see a lot about self-examination, spiritual self-examination. Why did this happen to me? What does this mean? Why is this important? Why is it significant? Okay? And all of those things are going to play into the literature that you're going to read here with Bradstreet, particularly the poems that deal with her relationships and the things that happen to her. A couple of things that you should probably know, and I'll bring this up a little bit as we go, but there are a lot of myths about Puritans. Take a look down at the bottom right there, well, the center right, I guess, the get-ups and the outfits that we all dress up in around Thanksgiving time. This is the goofiest thing in the world. The Puritans never dressed like that. They dressed more like the picture on the bottom left. That's more like what a Puritan would have dressed like. They would have had colorful clothes, not black. They wouldn't have worn buckles all over the place. In fact, buckles weren't really used in fashion or anything for another 75 or 80 years later. They wouldn't have known what you were doing. The stovepipe hats and the goofy things and the black and white, none of that stuff they would have worn. They wouldn't have run around with these big giant blunderbuss guns with the flared ends and muzzles. They wouldn't have. And also we have some other misconceptions, and that is, number one, they didn't have anything against sex. They weren't anti-sex at all. And they also didn't believe that it was bad for you to drink alcohol or smoke. They didn't think it was particularly good to drink too much, that's for sure. But they thought it was something wrong with you. If you were a married couple and you didn't have children, it wouldn't be uncommon that someone would come knocking at your door, an elder from the church, and say, what's up? Why aren't you having children? Or if you drank too much, of course they would say something about it, but they thought drinking alcohol was good for your health. The water was pretty bad, so you didn't have a lot of choice. They thought smoking was kind of a nasty habit, but they didn't think it was terribly sinful. So we have a lot of myths about Puritanism. I'll bring a couple of these up as we go along, but it's important to know that our picture of the Puritans has been tainted. It's been changed. Who did it? The Victorians did. They painted a picture of their predecessors that was totally inaccurate. Imagine for a moment that we drew pictures or painted pictures of Victorians wearing flapper outfits from the 20s. Something a Victorian would never wear, right? Totally inaccurate. The reason we look at the Pilgrims the way we do and we have these stupid get-ups at Christmas time is because the Victorians painted them that way, because they thought all those buckles and all that black looked old-timey and dignified, and they thought of their ancestors that way, when in fact they were Renaissance people. They wore flamboyant and colorful outfits. They believed in, eating and drinking and accumulating, wealth. They were hardly Franciscans. Very different from our current perception of them. Anyway, we'll go with another video here, and stay tuned for part 2.